And this week we're looking at Luke chapter 9. We see Jesus taking three of his closest disciples, and they go up the mountain, and he shows them the fullness of who he is. It is this moment of confusion. They don't know what's going on. They're enveloped in a cloud, but they do what all of us have to do when we don't know what's going on and we don't know what the right action is. They stick with Jesus in the cloud. Okay, let's set the scene. So they're on this mountain. This is Transfiguration Sunday. So that's kind of a strange word, transfiguration. We don't use that all the time, but transformed, think of his figure, his face. It is transformed. It's transfiguration, and that is where they go up on the mountain and they see his face changed. Verse 29, it's like a flash of lightning. And he goes up on up onto this mountain with Peter, James, and John, three of his closest disciples. Remember, he has 12 disciples. These are three of his closest. And he gives them this glimpse of who he is. Verse 28, after 8 days, or about 8 days after Jesus said this. Now, whenever you see something like that, where you see a time marker, you know it's got to be something kind of big, right? So about 8 days after Jesus said this, right? So it makes me wonder, well, what did he say, right? What was it that we're marking here? When you think about how we mark time, if we say it was the year, it was the same year that we got married, or it was a couple of weeks after our child was born, or a few months after I started my new job. So something momentous, and then here's what's going on. So you look ahead, and you see in the couple of verses up above this, that Jesus was talking to his disciples, more or less beginning in verse 18. He says, "Who do the people, the crowd, say that I am?" And there they tell him, John the Baptist or Elijah, one of the prophets, come back to life. And he says, "What about you? Who do you think that I am?" And Peter gets it. Peter says, "I believe that you are the Christ, or the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And here we then see that Jesus fills out Peter's definition. He tells them that, yes, he is the Christ, he's the Messiah, but not as you've imagined it, that I will have to undergo suffering and death, but then I will be raised on the third day. That's verse 22. And this is a very momentous moment. That is why Luke is marking time in verse 28 from that moment when Peter got it and when Jesus fleshed out his identity. Because what we're seeing here is that is going to be the center, the moment of power, Jesus' death and resurrection that's going to liberate his people from sin. And it's no wonder then that a little bit later in this passage, beginning in verse 28, that when Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus, they talk about, look at verse 31, notice what they talk about. In verse 31, they spoke about his departure. And that word is literally in Greek, his exodus. And so we think about Moses leading the people of God through the first exodus, which is an exodus through water, an exodus out of the slavery that the Egyptians had subjected the people of Israel to. And then Jesus leading his people through a new exodus, which is an exodus from sin, liberation from sin. And that is all going to be connected back to what Jesus had told them about himself in this previous passage. Now, Peter and his companions, look at verse 32. Notice the disciples in this section. Notice how their comportment, their state of mind. Verse 32, what are they? They are very sleepy. They start off very sleepy. Now, this is not going to be the last time that they're with Jesus. He's praying and they fall asleep. But they're very sleepy. They're not in their right mind. They're very sleepy. But then they see his glory and they snap awake. And in verse 33, Moses and Elijah, right? These two prophets from the Old Testament are with Jesus. They're leaving Jesus, and Peter says, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." In this translation, it's in parentheses. Notice what Luke says about this. He did not, that's Peter, he did not know what he was saying. So first, the disciples, they are sleepy. Now Peter, he doesn't know what he's saying. He's confused. While they're speaking, verse 34, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, right? Covers them. They're lost in this cloud. Ever been lost in a foggy cloud? Maybe when you're driving or something? They're afraid as they enter the cloud. So, sleepy, confused, afraid. A voice comes from the cloud. This is the voice of God, verse 35. Notice what the voice says. "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." And we remember that Transfiguration Sunday is the last Sunday in the church season of Epiphany. That's another word we don't use all the time, but it just means the teaching the world who Jesus is. So we get another glimpse of who Jesus is, and next Sunday we're going to enter in the time of Lent, which is a season of preparing our hearts, getting ready to again hear the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection for us. This is my son, this is who he is. He's my son whom I have chosen. Listen to him. Verse 36, when the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone, and the disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen. So the disciples are up on the mountain. That changes. Verse 37, the next day they had come down from the mountain. This is important. A large crowd meets them. A man in the crowd says, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son." He's talking to Jesus, for he's my only child. A spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. Notice verse 40. What did this man do? A very natural thing to do. I begged your disciples to drive it out. Could they? No. Now, here they were. They went from the top of the mountain down to the valley. They had this experience of Jesus' glory, and now they have this confrontation with evil, and they can't do anything about it. You would think that the disciples would have the wherewithal to drive out this demon, but for whatever reason, they cannot. Jesus has compassion on the child, a compassion on this crowd. Verse 41, I mean, he seems to be attributing the situation to lack of faith, but to the sinfulness of what's going on. And he says, bring that boy here, bring the son here. Verse 42, the demon throws the child to the ground, but Jesus rebukes it, and it leaves him, and the boy is healed. He gives this boy back to his father. Now notice this. This is demonic oppression. It's an evil spirit. This is the work of the devil. We're not talking about mental illness. Mental illness existed then, just as it exists now. There are times when Jesus heals people, and it's not attributed to demons. So Jesus doesn't think that everything is an evil spirit. He knows which is which. And so you see both mental illness and regular physical illness, as well as demonic oppression, both then and now. We always want to be careful because it's easy sometimes to get this wrong, to talk about evil and evil spirits in a way that either pays too much attention to them or not enough attention to them. And with Jesus, it's always very precise. He knows what to do. When it's an evil spirit, it is by his power that it's cast out. When it is healing that a child or someone needs, it is through his healing mercy that the healing comes. Jesus doesn't treat everything as if it were an evil spirit. Now, here, then, we see that everyone marveled at that, and Jesus tells them a little bit more. Listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. So again, he brings it back around. This wasn't in the passage that Karen read, but he brings it back around to what he had told them before. Yes, I'm the Messiah. Yes, I'm the Son of God, but redefine my mission in your mind. It's going to involve suffering on your behalf. It's going to involve the cross and then also the resurrection. So here's the scene. The disciples have been up to the top. They've seen the glory of God. They've been down to the valley. They've come face to face with evil, and they don't know what to do. Here's the scene. The disciples are sleepy. They're confused. They're afraid, and they are powerless. Have you ever been there with them? Because I have. Have you ever been sleepy, confused, afraid, and powerless, maybe all at the same time? I mean, this is kind of the human condition, right? They're worn out. They don't know what's going on. They don't know what God's doing. They're afraid, and they cannot do anything about this tremendous evil that is happening right in front of them. And contrast this with Jesus. I mean, Jesus, he's on the mountaintop. He is at peace. He is praying. He's shining with the radiance of God's glory. The voice of God names him and claims him. This is my son whom I have chosen. Listen to. Jesus is centered, and the disciples, they don't know what to do or they can't do it. Notice that contrast. And it strikes me that when we're in these moments that we've got to do exactly like what the disciples do. They just keep sticking with Jesus. He says go up, they go up. He says go down, they go down. They are stuck with Jesus. They cling to him in the midst of all of the confusion and the tiredness and the powerlessness. And it's right when they see, it seems like they're seeing the most of Jesus and he's going to show them more of himself, but they are going to be entering into this deeper understanding of what it means to be his disciples. But yet, this is not about knowledge, right? God speaks, but God just tells them, focus on Jesus. Stick with Jesus. He's my son. Listen to him. But God doesn't give them a huge revelation right here, just the basic revelation, the most important revelation. This is my son. Stick with him. And the reality is that this encounter on the mountaintop is not a knowledge encounter. This is about power. Jesus has not promised that if they follow him up the mountain and then go back down into the valley with him, that they will have it all figured out. What he has done here is show them his power. And part of what I think this means is when we do not know what's going on, when we are tired or confused or afraid or powerless, then we are called to do just like these disciples and keep putting one foot in front of the other following Jesus. Jesus has not called us to have perfect knowledge. He has called us to trust him. He has not called us to have it all together, to always know what to do. He's called us to rely on his power. Jesus has called us to keep moving, not to try to hang on to or to build a little shelter around some experience that we've had with God in the past, or maybe even some experience that has broken us down and left us feeling like a victim. He's called us to keep seeking him in our lives. In the here and now, we're called to stick with Jesus in the cloud. Jesus gives us what we need to follow him, but not necessarily what we need to understand everything that's going on. And I think this is part of what the voice from the cloud means. I mean, the disciples are in the cloud, which means they cannot see the whole landscape. They do not have a perfect perspective. Yet they hear the voice of God telling them, this is my son whom I have chosen, listen to him. They can't see, but they know whom they have to listen to. I don't know about you, but I find myself feeling like the disciples more often than not. I find myself feeling confused, feeling worn out, feeling afraid, feeling powerless. I see things, I don't know what to do. I'm afraid for certain situations. I don't know how they're going to turn out for people that I care about. I don't have the power. I need to change things. But God says, this is my son whom I have chosen. Listen to him. When we're lost in the cloud, the only thing we can do is stick with Jesus. And I think that so often following Jesus as his disciples is going to kind of feel like this. And what's worse, a lot of times for me, is that even after I've made a right decision, I think this is the case for a lot of us, or I've made a decision, I'll end up second-guessing myself. I'll say, did I get that right? And sometimes the cloud never seems to clear, and you never know if you did the right thing. I remember once we were faced with a very big decision in our lives, and we talked it through, and we made our decision, and we were invited over, and I was sitting next to a wise elder in the church, and he looks at me and he says, how did you know? And I gave him an answer that was all right, but I remember thinking to myself, what I ought to just say is, no, I don't know anything. I have no idea if I'm doing the right thing. I don't know where this is going, but this is what we have chosen to do. We're walking in the cloud here. And I'd guess that many of us have felt like this. I mean, Jesus calls us up the mountain and into the cloud even when we don't know what's going on. And like God said, out of the cloud, we're called to follow him, to listen to him. Now notice, this is not blind obedience. Blind obedience would be waiting around for God to tell us something and then doing it. And what I've found is that we don't do much that way. Rather, this is trust. This is putting one foot in front of the other and walking with Jesus even when we're not sure about where we're going, when we're not sure about what we're doing, when we're not sure what's going on, or even if Jesus is with us. This is sticking with Jesus in the cloud. And it's pretty much what everybody in the scriptures who's ever taken a step of faith has had to do. I mean, just think of the Old Testament. Think of Abraham, who God called to leave his family and his home turf and to set out based on a promise. Think of Moses, whom God called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, but who, when he got out of Egypt, realized that he had this disobedient, grumbling, idolatrous people on his hands, that it was going to take 40 years in the wilderness to get Egypt out of the Israelites. Think of Esther, going before the king of Persia, even though she had no idea what would come next, and knowing full well it could mean that she would lose her life. Think of Daniel, praying at his window each day, even though he didn't know if he might be caught, thrown to the lions. Think of the women going to the tomb, or the disciples waiting in Jerusalem for some power to come upon them from on high, or Saul, who was told after the blinding light on that Damascus road, "Get up and enter into the city, and you will be told what to do." Anybody who's ever followed Jesus anywhere has had to walk on the cloud, has been tired and confused and afraid and powerless. Anyone who's tried their hand as a disciple has had to learn to trust. Why is it like this? And I've got to be honest with you, I'm not sure. I mean, so often I've felt that life would really be a lot easier if Jesus would just tell us what's going on. Just say, "Do this." And then we could know what our part to play was. But the reality is that Jesus has created discipleship so that it involves trust. Even his first disciples, right there in front of him, hearing his words, hearing the word of God rumbling through their ears, they had to learn to trust. They had to learn to trust, and so will we. And this is because God doesn't really want us to grow as rule followers. And look, I'm a firstborn. I'm all about following the rules. I mean, I married the baby of the family, so you can imagine how that works. But the reality is, listen to this, the reality is that anybody can follow the rules externally and still not have a heart that loves God and loves neighbor internally. Anybody can drive between the lines, keep the speed limit, properly adjust the rear view mirror, fasten their seatbelts, but be filled with anger and hatred and judgmentalism. God desires that we be transformed in the image of Christ, that we become the kind of people who have drawn close enough to him that we intuitively know what he would do in our shoes, that we see redemption and life and the working of his Spirit, and we move in that direction. And there's no simple right or wrong answer that he could give us for that. What Jesus most needs from us is to stick with it, to stay in there, to be present, to find our way through with him. Jesus calls us to stick with him in the cloud. What this means is that there are going to be lots of times when we search for God to give us an answer, and we won't feel like he's told us what to do. We see through a glass darkly. I mean, anytime we're dealing with God, we're going to experience mystery, uncertainty, often fear. I mean, there's a reason the ancient prophets spoke of the fear of the Lord. What God is thinking and doing is always going to be greater than what we can get a handle on. The scriptures speak of God as either so bright that we cannot look upon him, or wrapped in darkness, and it amounts to the same thing. Psalm 97 reads, "The Lord is king, let the earth rejoice, let the many coastlands be glad. Clouds and thick darkness are all around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne." The prophet Jeremiah, he experienced the destruction of his home city, Jerusalem, and he prayed, "God, you have wrapped yourself with the cloud so that no prayer can pass through." And what this means is that we're going to have to remember that even when we are seeking to walk faithfully, when we are praying our way through the cloud, that we can still get it wrong, still make mistakes. We'll need to use provisional language like, "I believe God is telling me," or "I think that Jesus is leading me in this direction." I get wary whenever someone says, God told me such and such. It's not for nothing that the scriptures instruct us, do not despise the words of prophets, but test everything, hold fast to what is good. We're going to have to gently, in love, recognize our own fallibility and frailty. In fact, the people that have seemed most guided, grounded, and led to me haven't usually been the ones who are most self-confident about what God has told them. They've been the ones who have been most willing to step into the cloud and take a risk. You see, faith is not about certainty in the cloud. It's about walking. This doesn't mean that we can't be convicted about something, that we can't say, here I stand, I will not be moved. But whenever we do that, we still have to seek to have a teachable spirit that's open to God's leading. The other thing that this means is that even when we think we're doing the right thing, we're going to feel mixed emotions. Even when we're feeling convicted in our hearts about something, we're going to experience confusion and doubt and second guessing. I don't think I've ever done anything in my life that's important where I haven't second guessed myself a little bit. Honestly, I walk out into the cloud every week, at the very least by wrestling with the scriptures and saying, God, what am I supposed to be preaching about this week? But here's the thing. No matter what's tearing you up inside, no matter what kind of turmoil you're feeling, Jesus has promised to be with you. Jesus was with his disciples in their tiredness, their confusion, their fear, their powerlessness. He took the disciples up the mountain. He prayed for them. He stood with them in the cloud. He led them back down the mountain into the valley. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Horse and His Boy, in the Chronicles of Narnia series, young Shasta finds himself riding in dense fog along a mountain path, and as he journeys forlorn and beat down by all that's happened to him, he discovers that there is a huge, powerful presence that is walking along with him on that path through the fog. And he's afraid, but the presence speaks and tells him how all along he has been with Shasta at key points in his life, guiding him. And finally, Shasta works up the courage to ask, "Who are you?" "Myself," said the voice, very deep and low, so that the earth shook. And again, "Myself," loud and clear. And then the third time, "Myself," whispered so softly you could hardly hear it, and yet it seemed to come from all around you as if the leaves rustled with it. Shasta was no longer afraid that the voice belonged to something that would eat him, nor that it was the voice of a ghost, but a new and different sort of trembling came over him. Yet he felt glad too. We learn in that story that the presence, that voice, was the great lion Aslan, the figure of Christ in C.S. Lewis's Narnia, who has walked with the boy Shasta in the dark through the fog. Jesus will be with us in the dark and cloudy places. Jesus is with us in those places of confusion and heartache and powerlessness and pain. And so maybe what we need to do is not wait around for Jesus to give us all the right answers so much as commit to sticking with him no matter how thick the cloud gets. And when we're not sure where we're going, we keep reaching out for Christ in the darkness. We put one foot in front of the other. We walk the path with him. Remember, it was by a cloud by day that the people of Israel were led in the wilderness. Worship will align us with God's reality. Prayer keeps us listening. The scriptures guide us. And we walk. Sometimes we're going to be on the mountaintop. Sometimes we'll be down in those valleys. Sometimes we'll be enveloped and swallowed up and lost in the cloud. But we will stick with Jesus. And we'll just keep putting one foot in front of another. Amen.